Okay, let's get back to Chapter 1. And I brought you up to the introduction and our learning objectives. And let me just recap what those learning objectives are. The PowerPoint says that that you should understand things like the goals of archaeological surveys, methods of horizontal and vertical excavation, use of quantification in artifact and ecofact analysis, and the ways comparison and analogy are used in archaeology. Now, to break that down a little bit further, survey is finding archaeological sites, but it does a little bit more than that, and we'll cover what that means. Surveys are surface identification and understanding, things that don't require you to disassemble and deconstruct the archaeology. They're low impact, but they can actually have high yield. You can survey an entire region and understand where the settlements and the sites and the archaeology is, how they interrelate to one another, different types of sites. Maybe one is a place where people lived, maybe one is a place where people worked, maybe one is a place where people hunted, maybe one is a place where people gathered. And understanding the relationships of how people interact in their life, in their landscape, can help you understand a lot about people, the way people lived in the past. Also, it can help to identify where places for further investigation, like excavations, ought to take place, where here's a good opportunity for me to say a little bit more about the life of people in the past by answering specific questions about this particular site. So maybe you want to know about the way people hunted. If you find through survey a site that is a hunting site, or that you suggest might be, maybe looking a little bit more carefully through excavation is something that you can do. But once you excavate things, you're pulling stuff out of the ground and you've got to be able to make sense of that. So quantifying that information through getting data points and finding a standardized way of recording and quantifying artifacts and what are called ecofacts. Artifacts are things that are constructed by human hands. Artificial is a good way to remember that. So artificial things are artifacts, and ecofacts are things that are part of the ecosystem. So animal bones or seeds of plants that were either gathered, wild species, or domesticated species that are cultivated and grown. Also the environment, is it forested? Is it grasslands? All of these ecofactual things tell you about the context, the background information for where people were living. We live in a desert right now here in Nevada. Was it always a desert? Was there more moisture at some point? Were there other types of animals that don't exist today? So all of these things help you to understand the information that you pull out of excavation and survey. And then you've got to make sense of that, and ways of comparing and using analogy are used in archaeology to try and give a more anthropological perspective. So we aren't just a combination of our artifacts. I am not a combination of my glasses and my clothes and my shoes and my books. I'm more than that. So the way that we take all of these data points together, we've got to arrange it into a mosaic based on the way we understand that humans operate. And so using comparison and analogy in archaeology helps us to put all of these pieces together. So let's take these points one by one. I have a slide saying that we sort of go through stages of data recovery, including things like survey is often the first thing that you do when you come to an area that hasn't been studied. Now, I mentioned in the previous lecture that CRM, cultural resource management, is something, an industry that actually has a real need for new archaeologists. So if you're interested in this is actually, there's job growth in this in this industry. One of the things that CRM companies do is, even before you survey, even before you go out into the field, you look at the literature. What has been published on this before? What do we know about this place that has already been studied? This is desk-based assessment. So you sit down, you say, okay, is there anything that we already know? There's a site here. That might prevent or instruct a developer to maybe put their road or their pipeline someplace else because they don't want to bother with this, with destroying or disturbing archaeology. But if there isn't any published literature on or anything known about an area, you might need to go out and find out for yourself. Survey is usually one of the first things that's done in this respect in terms of fieldwork. If you find a site that is worthy of further investigation, you might excavate it, which means that you're digging into the ground and you are deconstructing the remains that were left behind by past people. That's excavation, and this is done in a couple of ways, both vertically, that you're actually digging down, which means you're going back further and further in time, but also if you find a particular time period that has some really good remains, some really good evidence, you might expand horizontally to try and find out more about that particular time period before maybe going further down back through time. All the while, everything that you do, you should be recording. As I said before, the difference between a looter or a vandal and an archaeologist is that we record what we do, that we publish and we make a permanent record of the evidence that we've encountered, because once we've deconstructed it, you can't put it back there. It's a one-time deal, so you've got to do a good job of it. And some of the things that we do are photographs. We take pictures of these things. We also illustrate, and illustrations, drawings, are sometimes superior to photographs, and this may be surprising to you that, you know, photograph is just light that bounces off something and comes back to a receptor, a camera. It's very honest. But an illustration is an expert's eye about what are the important details. A camera can't make decisions about what is important about what you're looking at. But an illustrator can say, okay, this stone here is part of this wall, but I can tell that this one is actually part of collapse or rain runoff, and it's not part of the wall, it's not bonded to it. A photograph may not be able to pick up some of these details, whereas a professional trained archaeologist can do that, and you can indicate that through illustrations better than you can through photographs. And then also, I have in this slide flotation. This is actually shorthand for basically we look microscopically at everything. So every tiny trace of everything that we find gets analyzed. Every speck of dirt, every microscopic pollen grain, and this is sometimes done through what's called flotation, which is when you dig up dirt from the ground, you can sift it and sieve it to try and through mesh sieves to try and get the tiny little fragments of things. But you can also, things like organic remains that are charred and actually sometimes thousands and thousands of years old, these can actually also be preserved through time. And these float to the top. So we also use what are called wet sieves that separate the floating organic remains from the artifacts that are made of more massive materials that sink to the bottom of a wet sieve. So we analyze everything. Also, I should point out at this point that I'm an archaeologist. I've been an archaeologist for many, many years. I don't own any artifacts. I own 0 artifacts. I'm not in this business to own archaeology. I'm here to study it and understand it. Archaeologists don't get employed to loot and to make money off of what we find. We tell stories about the past. That's how we get paid. I get paid to teach you about how to do archaeology. CRM archaeologists get paid to do compliance for government officials. And developers pay these specialists to write reports. But archaeologists don't make money off of what they find. That's not what archaeology is about. We're trying to tell a story about the past through scientific analysis. So let's look at survey more carefully. You want to have some kind of a survey design before you start doing it. You've got to look at maps. You've got to sort of say, okay, how are we going to tackle this? What is the grain of detail that we want to analyze? Do we need to cover every single square inch of what of the territory that we're looking at, or can we spread out a little bit and maybe cover every every kilometer or every 10 meters or something like that. So the purpose is to map physical human activity in an area. Now, you may be thinking, all right, well, how do you even know this? Well, when you find something, well, it depends. Frankly, I've worked in Scotland for many years, and in the Bronze Age, or after the Bronze Age, I should say, peat bogs covered the landscape and trapped pre-Bronze Age landscapes below many meters tall of peat. So if you walk along on the surface of the top of these peat bogs today, you're not going to see anything. So survey isn't going to help you in that respect. You need to find a way to get down below the peat to see the pre-Bronze Age materials. Now, you'll get things on the surface that date to later periods, but you're not going to get these prehistoric remains. And in fact, often laying down pipelines and things like that is where discoveries are made in places like Scotland. But here in the Nevada desert, there's things that are sitting on the surface that have been sitting there for 10,000 years. And they've been undisturbed or relatively undisturbed because there hasn't been a lot of deflation of the landscape through too much erosion, and there hasn't been any deposits that have come up over the top of it either. Now, that's not always the case, but there's other activities where when you have things that are buried below the surface, there are other processes that bring up things to the surface, cast them upwards. Tree roots, animal burrows, plowing the fields. Erosion will have things, will cut through, and then things will spill out of the side of little ravines. So just because it's buried doesn't mean that some items aren't going to make their way to the surface, and that can give us an indication of what might be buried below your feet. It gets harder for things that are millions of years old, and we're going to see this, that when you're talking about millions of geological time, millions of years of deposition, we can be talking kilometers below the earth. It's just not practical for an archaeologist to go digging kilometers down. Way too expensive, and you don't know what you're going to get. So you have these hot spots, places like the Great Rift Valley in Eastern Africa, where there's buried landscapes below the earth, and then big ravines that have been cut. That's why it's called the Great Rift Valley, is there's a big ravine, like a Grand Canyon, that runs up Eastern Africa, and it cuts into these old landscapes, and they're spilling out the sides of the ravine. And that's why we know so much about early human history, or pre-human history, or I should say archaeology, from these trapped landscapes in this area, because we don't have to fight to get to them. They're actually coming to us through erosionary processes. So sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you actually just have to get out there and hoof it across landscapes. And the purpose is to create maps where we know that human activity took place. But you also have to have particular project goals in mind. Are you interested in every period of human history? Usually surveys, yes. I'm just recording whatever I find. Some, I've participated in some that are only interested in particular periods of time. Like, we don't really care about these later periods. Someone else is doing that. We don't have enough time or money to do that. We're targeting these particular periods of time because that is what our research design is. You may say that I want to cover a huge area, hundreds of kilometers, square kilometers, and I've only got 5 people to do this survey, which means we're going to have to spread out, and if we want to cover this area in good time, we're going to have some gaps in between. Or maybe it's a smaller area, and you want to get microscopic coverage of this area. 1 meter, let's say. Every meter you've got somebody there, and you're spending a lot of time. You're going to have finer grained details for that. Sometimes these surveys aren't exactly comparable either. What you need to think about in doing a survey is that things like the erosionary processes, the preservation of sites may make them either invisible. What if there's grasses in the way that, you can't see the ground? I've been on surveys that other different times of the year to try and increase visibility. If you go into an arid climate in the springtime, you're going to get grasses springing up everywhere. But if you go in the autumn, it's going to be a lot easier to see stuff. So all of these factors have got to be kept in mind. There's a term I'd like you to know. It's called taphonomy. T-A-P-H-O-N-M-O. Sorry. T-A-P-H-O-N-O-M-Y. O-M-Y. There you go. Taphonomy. And it means literally the science or the study of the tomb. But in this specific case, really what we mean by taphonomy is what happens to things after they've been left behind for time to work on them. So some things don't preserve. So would you expect to find a basket from 10,000 years ago? Probably not. It'd be hard for that to remain preserved. That's taphonomy. Taphonomy tells us we should not expect to see these things. If you do find that, what are the conditions? Maybe it was really arid. Maybe there's no moisture at all, and so this didn't deteriorate through time as fast as it would in other climates. Maybe it's at the bottom of the ocean or in a peat bog, and anaerobic conditions mean that no bacteria have broken these things down. Or maybe the bacterial conditions are so rapid that no organic materials remain and only things like stones do. So understanding the conditions that affect preservation tell you what to expect and what not to expect. That means that in certain types of environments and certain types of geology, going out on a survey, you'll know what to look for and what not to really bother with. So if you find, I get this with students in the field all the time, people will say, "Oh, I found a bone." I'm like, "Yeah, it's a bone, but it's probably very recent animal that was maybe from last year or something like that, and that's not really what we're looking for." So all of these things need to be considered for you to understand your survey material. And the methods that you use are things like walking over the land, just walking in a straight line. That it helps to have maps or GPS devices to help you do a straight line. And you're trying to replicate that onto a map. That I have a map here and I've walked this straight line, which means that everything here I've recorded and I've done that. So I can tick that line on that map off. And then here's another line and another line. You might test along the way that you find a little patch where there's some either broken pottery or some stone tools that have been left behind. You say, okay, maybe there's more here. I'll do a shovel test. I'll see if there's anything below the surface in a very small area. And that may tell me that there's potential to do a proper excavation later on. You can also see through the dirt. Remote sensing is you can use satellite images and certain types of coloration and infrared and all sorts of methods to LiDAR as well that will tell you things about the landscape through technology. Geophysics, things like ground penetrating radar, magnetometry, resistivity, these are all methods of seeing below the earth as well. So you can, usually takes a little bit longer than remote sensing from satellites, but you can run particular types of technological devices over the landscape, and that will tell you not just what's on the surface, but what's below the surface. These days, we use GPS. You don't have to. Some surveyors go old school and they use things like plane tables and trig points and things like that. But GPS makes it a little bit easier for people to know in real time where they are and where they are on the map. And that helps them then to replicate their maps better and faster. And the way to organize a lot of this spatial data is through what's called Geographical Information Systems, GIS otherwise. And these are software applications that process big amounts of spatial data that help you to create maps and layered maps with different types of information on them. And there's actually in your book, there's a figure that shows the different types of layers that can go over the same survey area, that show things like elevation models, that you can make 3D models of areas. But you can also, what may not appear on an elevation model where you've got 3Ds, you may not have things like where streets or roads are, or what types of land use or coverage there is. Is there water here? Is there plants here? Topographical maps show you, and things like cadastral maps tell you where people's property is. So maybe a line that you see on a satellite image, you're like, ooh, that's a really interesting straight line. Oh, you go there, you look at the cadastral map, oh, that's a boundary between two people's property. That makes sense. There's a fence there. Hydrology, what the area that is drained by certain water courses, that can help you to understand maybe zones where people lived, or routes where people traveled. Aerial photography can also be overlapped onto these GIS layers, some of them historical. So lots of territories and land has been photographed even a long time ago, maybe even 100 years ago, that the surface, the topography, the landscape has changed since then. And so maybe it's development has destroyed all this stuff, but we can actually go back in time 100 years and put historic aerial photographs over them, say, okay, there was a site here, but it's been destroyed. So let's say you do find a site through a survey, and you're like, okay, this is actually really interesting, and there are some research questions I'd like to further ask of this particular spot. So once you have a map, you understand where this location is and how it fits into its wider landscape, and you might want to start excavating it. Now, the first thing you need to do is you need to start digging through the ground. Well, no, that's not actually the first thing you need to do. You need to start organizing your spatial data of where you're excavating. And then you can start to excavate and dig down. Archaeology tends to use things like grids. So we create our own localized maps for a site. We like to dig in boxes, and I'll show you why that's important in just a moment. It's because we want to record what it is that we're digging by demonstrating through cross-section what we have already dug away. So horizontal excavation is used to expose remains. Vertical excavation is used to expose a sequence of occupation, starting at the latest and going back through time to earlier occupation or usage. Any site that's occupied repeatedly over time is going to have some kind of a vertical element to it. Vertical in this case means chronological in some way. Horizontal excavation is used to expose remains from a single point in time.